Okay, guys, we are back and we are doing voiceover again because there was zero pep in my step when I recorded this. So I've got to rely on the voiceover again, which I'd rather not tell you guys about because now you know that I had the option to go back and change the audio if I made a bad joke. But I'm not going to. We're just going to keep it real. We're going to keep it moving. We're going to keep on trucking along. So I'm talking about my croquis for some reason, but we're actually going to be working with the first croquis, with the traditional croquis. Yep, no, not that one, Jen. Nope, the other one. First one. There we go. Yep, that one. Okay, just ignore myself. When we are working with marker, it is really important to erase your lines. And this is because when you put marker on your marker paper, if you have graphite on the paper, you will get the graphite stuck between your marker and your paper and you will not be able to get it out. And it just kind of makes your croquis look ugly and dirty. So let's not get on that track, okay? I would really love it if you guys kept your croquis clean and cute and funky, right? So we are going to be using marker right now. And then I'll talk about watercolor, but that's a different day, okay? Let's do one thing at a time here. So I usually erase all of my pencil lines, but until you guys get a little bit more comfortable shading in your own croquis and working with marker yourself, I'm just going to kind of leave most of them there just so you can see it. I work for the people, guys. I'm here for you. I want you guys to see where I'm going. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a light source. Especially when you have a collection, you use the same light source for all of your croquis. So I just indicated a little arrow to show where my light source is. Next, what I do is I lay in all of my highlights. So your highlights are the closest spot to the light source. So that's going to be like your shoulder, your bicep, the bust, because it does come out and around. There is volume to it. So usually there is some kind of highlight on both of the busts, unless it's like angled away from the light source. But that's kind of a different story. We'll get into that later. Around the neck and collar on the side closer to the light source, there's nothing really under the bust that has a highlight. There's just a lot of shadow. That's everything opposite of the light source is going to have a shadow. So under the bust, on the side of the arm, yeah, that arm is all shadow. That side of the arm is all shadow. And then the darkest shadows are the areas that are farthest from the light source and also overlapped by a different body part. So, like the inside of that thigh, both inside of the thighs actually are going to be really dark. The side of the right hip, we'll talk about right as in what you guys are seeing, not the croquis actual right side. So the right side of the croquis legs, those are all going to be really dark. Under the knees, under the bust usually has a really dark shadow. So after that, we go in, we erase those lines again. You know, anything that you mapped out, we're just going to get rid of it, okay? Then I'm gonna struggle to open my marker for a few minutes, and once I finally get it open, we are gonna start shading. So we shade from the head downwards to the feet, and this is because when you are working and you have your hand on your paper, sometimes you might like pick up a little bit of the marker on the side of your hand like you do like with graphite when you're writing or pen, and so you just want to prevent any smearing and work from the top down. So with this set of markers, I have a chisel tip and a pointed tip. I usually work with the pointed tip because it's easier to control and kind of get into smaller areas. But the chisel tip does have its purposes. I will talk about that later on when we get to it. But, you know, for the most part, I usually use the angled tip. And so what I like to do when I'm shading my croquis is I like to use the edge of that angle tip. Do not put your marker straight up and down on the paper. You're going to ruin your marker. And that's not going to be fun when you need to buy new ones, especially because they're so expensive. So what I do when I shade is I work in circular motions, and you should too. And this is because Markers are typically made with alcohol in them, and so they dry very quickly, right? And so when you are working in circular motions, you can kind of pick up that alcohol a little bit again and almost reactivate it in a way that will allow more blending than if you went in strokes and you let that stroke dry, because you are going back and forth and you have different parts of the marker drying at different times, and it just gets super weird. So just shade in a circle. It's just more efficient and it looks so much better at the end of the day. So just work in circles. I promise it'll be a lot better. While we're on the topic of, making good looking croquis, you should also work in sections. This is such a smart thing to do, guys, because when you work in sections, you are letting less of that marker dry at once. And so with like a naked croquis, it's a little bit different because there's so much that needs to be filled in at once. And so it's kind of like inevitable that something's going to dry a little bit. And so you just need to be a little bit careful about overlapping. However, when you are working with clothed croquis and just shading garments in general, you should really make sure that you are working in sections. So you will see that I am always working in sections. I will always do like one arm at a time, one leg at a time, one part of the body at a time, and I will never fault from that. I will never stray from that strategy. You know what I'm saying. It's super important. Just make sure your croquis look good. I was gonna say something about, seeing a different set of croquis that did not come out of MSU. You wouldn't dare see this croquis come out of MSU. Not this Big Ten school. Different Big Ten school. Will not name names. The only shade I will be throwing today is on my croquis. So, with that being said, I'm going down the arm now, and you will notice that everything that I'm doing in this first layer is the same. When you are just shading in a normal croquis, you will place all of the midtones down first, and then you will go in and you will fill in the shadows. If you are doing a shiny croquis, which were like my watercolor croquis, if you guys remember that, then that's a different technique. Then you lay in your highlights and you just leave the paper showing, and then you'll go in and you'll fill in like all of these midtones around that highlight, and then you'll fill in your shadow. But I have a shiny fabric video tutorial that I will be showing you guys. So it's the same technique as that. So when you guys watch that video, we can easily apply it to the croquis themselves rather than garments. Now what I'm doing is I'm just going through the leg. I'm still just going in and adding all of these midtones. Sometimes this is like a little bit of a time-consuming process just because it's a naked croquis and because there's just so much skin and there's no garment. There's nothing blocking any skin. So bear with me right now. I'm speeding up the video because I was just sitting here in pain trying to come up with things to say, and I realized that I should just speed it up because we're all going to be doing the same thing. You're just going to fill in these croquis in circles, and you're going to fill in the whole thing with all these midtones until it is all completed, and then you're going to let it sit and you're going to let it dry for a few minutes. So when you let your croquis dry for a few minutes, that will let all of that marker dry, and when you go back in for that second layer for the shadows, which you can see that I'm starting to do right now in the places that we've talked about, you will see a little bit more definition in that shadow, which is something that is really nice. But if you want to have a more blended look, then you will add the marker on top of the wet marker. You'll see me do that in my ruffle video. I have a top where I do a lot of blending with the marker. But for now, when you have shadows on the body, there is usually a definite line where you can see that. And so that is what I usually do when I'm shading my croquis. And I'm usually not pointing at my marker all the time. I don't know what I was getting at there. But this is what I want to talk about. I want to talk about these shadows. So, like I said earlier, it's always the part of the body that is opposite of the light source, right? So sometimes we have a little bit of trouble figuring out where highlights are, just because we're not used to looking at them. We're used to looking at shadows when we're drawing or when we were in art class. So when you are working with your poses and with your croquis, if you do have a hard time figuring out where those highlights are, figure out where the shadows are, and the highlights are usually on the opposite part of the body part from that shadow. We just usually see shadows more because there's a larger difference in value between the two than there are with highlights in midtones, especially when, your croquis isn't greased up and oily and all shiny and stuff. So that's just another reason to use a reference photo for poses when you're first starting out. I highly recommend it. You will be able to see where the shadows are, where to place your highlights, all of that beautiful, beautiful information when you are first learning how to draw a croquis. A few things to think about if you are coming up with your own poses are where the light source is, so where the light just naturally hits more. Especially on rounded objects, you will see like a smoother transition between those highlights and shadows. Are there any body parts that are overlapping a different body part or casting a shadow on it? They don't need to be right next to each other. That left leg is still casting a shadow on the right leg, even though they aren't right on top of each other. And this is because with the light, there's a large shadow being cast and it can hit from farther away. And lastly, we'll get into this later, but are there any shadows cast by the garment? You got to think about all these different ways that shadows can be created, the opacity of a shadow, how dark it is, and those are just things to all think about. So, once again, really, really getting on a tangent here, but it is a tangent worth mentioning. So, as I'm filling in this leg, I want you guys to notice how I am shading in the shadows along the part of the leg that is opposite of the highlight or opposite of the light source. And under the knee is a great place to shade, especially under the knee. That is very important. And then along the calf, as well as the area around the ankle and under the ankle. Also, the bottom of your feet usually have shadows. Even if you are putting shoes on your croquis, if you were wearing like open toe heels or something, you are going to still see a shadow under those toes. And so make sure you include that because that is also very important. Just creating this dimension within your croquis is something that is vital to creating something that looks professional, right? You want to make sure that you have your shadows in the right places. After this, I usually just let my croquis dry for a little bit. I sit and I just contemplate life, and then I go back and I add darker shadows along those darkest spots. So any area that just naturally doesn't get much light, so anything opposite of the light source and has a shadow cast on it, or something that just doesn't have any light whatsoever, is going to be a super important spot to include those really dark shadows. I usually see a lot of really dark shadows around the inner thigh, maybe the outside of the thigh, on the opposite side of the light source, under the bust, and then usually one of the arms or legs when you have some kind of posed croquis will have more shadow because it is behind the whole body itself and it's sitting in that body's shadow. And you will notice throughout these videos that I go back a lot into different shadows, and I will go in and I will add shadows in different places, and that's something I want you guys to make sure that you kind of get in the habit of, just looking at the Croquis as a whole and seeing if there's any area that you might have missed where there needs to be a shadow. That's something that I do a lot, even with garments or with just details or hair. I won't just stay in one spot the whole time. I do move around a lot, and that's something that I really want you guys to kind of get in the habit of as well. Just moving around, kind of making sure that you are adding all those dark shadows where they need to be and creating that dimension. But other than that, you guys just shaded your first Croquis, and that's super awesome. I'm so proud of you guys. Look at that. And I hope that you kind of continue to explore your Croquis and their style as we continue in this class and learn more.